Hi, I'm Shawn Micallef, and I'm here to talk about the art of history, which is a funny thing to talk about in Toronto because if you ask people on the street or yourselves or your relatives or, God forbid, people from the rest of Canada, what is Toronto's history, most of them will probably tell you Toronto has no history. It's just this place of condos and shopping malls and strip malls and highways and an ahistorical mayor. But Toronto is a city of history. We do have a long history and a kind of awesome one. We have a fort, which was the birthplace, arguably, of the city, down there by the historic freeway and the historic condos. But we have a lot of other sort of amazing social history in this city that we don't talk about that very much. We don't kind of pump ourselves up. We have an amazing draft dodger history from Vietnam War to much more recent wars and their attendant hippies and all the weirdo art projects and other social projects that they did and education projects. We have a great immigration story. We have the wonderful rebellion of 1837, which was the first kind of Wall Street thing, anti-Wall Street thing. Good Underground Railway history. We have people like Emma Goldman, the American anarchist who hung out here. Great Aboriginal history. Whether or not we honor it the way we should is another story, but we have it. Intellectual history. There's the whole Toronto School of Communications, like McLuhan, Innes, Glenn Gould. That all came from here. And then we got capital H history, that kind of History Channel history, which means war. And we have the War of 1812, and the War of 1812 is great because it was the first time Stephen Harper noticed Toronto. So we have this great history, but we're not very good at telling it the way, say, American cities are or European cities are. Torontonians are shy. Maybe it's a Canadian thing, but it's profound in this city. Getting Torontonians to talk about themselves, their place in the world, is like pulling teeth. Other places are really good at this. You go to London or Berlin, you can't walk half a block without seeing a plaque. That might be to an individual that lived there or to some world-changing event that happened there. Down south, Washington, the entire city is sort of like a monument to the history of America. When you walk around Toronto, you don't really get that sense. We have a few plaques here and there and a couple statues, often of British dudes. But there's not a lot of kind of physical stuff that tells us about ourselves. But I think that's a good thing, kind of a good thing. And I think Toronto's at a good spot. Because Marx, Karl, said, the tradition of all the dead generation weighs like a nightmare on the brain of the living. He may have had other intentions for that quote, but for Toronto, it's great because it means we're free. Other cities sometimes might drown in their history. You take a place like Edinburgh, and I know a few artists and kind of creative types that live there, and they say it's incredibly hard to do something new and contemporary in Edinburgh because the idea of Edinburgh was set 200, 300, 400 years ago, and you go to Edinburgh and you walk the Royal Mile to that castle and down to that castle and past Sean Connery's place. It's all magnificent and like Ivanhoe, and then what's new? Whereas Toronto, we don't have that kind of burden. In a lot of cities, European ones, some American ones, these are kind of overly historic, and they forget that the absolute constant in great cities is change, and this constant change and churning. And when they turn themselves into a museum or a work of art, they've kind of failed to live up or behave like a great city should. My previous examples of London, Berlin, with all their great capital H and small h history and plaques and statues to British and German dudes, are really good at also doing contemporary stuff. So they found a really good mix. But they don't freak out about it the way we do. But in Toronto, our dead are kind of chilled out. And they don't weigh on us and give us nightmares except for possible personal ones. And they let us be free. So I suspect that might be why in Toronto there's so much interesting arts and culture, and it sort of can flourish. It can flourish downtown and in the suburbs, in the weirdest places, in strip malls, in back alleys, in graffiti alleys, in guerrilla projects and parks, and it just can happen here because the idea of Toronto hasn't been established 200 or 300 years ago. In architecture, we have a really heterogeneous, dare I say it, beautiful style of mixed up Victorians next to skyscrapers that other cities can't do. Maybe it's the reason that we can have such a great immigration story, that every new person that comes to Toronto has a chance to make more history because the history hasn't been necessarily written for them. There's room for new histories, as well as class. we don't have that tradition of this one group of people being the important ones. If you talk to people at the Five Thieves or the Granite Club, they might tell you something different. But we do have a lighter version of class in this country, complicated but lighter. So back to Fort York. In the 1950s, we tried to build a freeway through it. And Big Daddy Gardner wanted to run it through the middle of the fort and move the fort to the exhibition. It wasn't important. It was modern Toronto, and we were doing new things. But we resisted that, and the Gardner has that wonderful, elegant, dare I say it, beautiful bend around Fort York, allowing the fort to flourish. In 1994, there was a group, an ad hoc group that came around the fort called the Friends of Fort York, one of those many Friends groups, there's Park Friends groups, and the Friends still exist. And their first the reason they came together was to start worrying about the encroachment of the city on the fort. But something interesting has happened in the last 10 years. The Friends and the fort itself has really embraced the city and started a dialogue with the condo towers. And now the fort is the center of what's going to be a new neighborhood of 20,000 people. It's capital H, historic fort, but it's also a dog park. And so which means it gets used 24 hours a day instead of when class trips come. So the fort has, and the history of Toronto is now mixed up in the city in a much different way that might not be possible in Paris or other great cities of the world who don't let their dogs go to the washroom on their historic sacred sites. So Toronto's loose, and we get to have this kind of wonderful balance and room in between big history and no history, and we all get to make our own history. So essentially our history in Toronto, our art of history and how we do history is the history of freedom. Thanks.